The chasm between the promises of artificial intelligence, or AI, and the reality of what AI can accomplish is closing faster than ever. Whether it's creating uncanny images, writing poetry, providing better information in a chatbot, writing its own code, or creating original video from text prompts, the output of AI is increasingly disrupting long-established domains that were once only relegated to humans. This week, I'm talking with Boris Cergol, the regional head of data at Endava. He has spent over a decade in the AI and machine learning space, and together we discuss the attention-gathering abilities of AI, use cases for AI and machine learning in business, the risks that AI technology poses to society, balancing centralized and decentralized AI systems, the challenge of overcoming bad or a lack of data, and how AI could change the attention economy. Let's get to it.
Welcome to Next in Queue, the podcast for contact center and customer experience professionals. Next in Queue is brought to you by Happy 2 Vision. Eliminate blind spots and see right through every conversation with Happy 2 Vision. Learn more at happitu.com. Now, here's your host, Rob Dwyer.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Next in Queue. Today, I am joined by Boris Cergol. Welcome, Boris. How are you?
Hi, Rob. Thanks for inviting me. I'm great.
I am glad to hear it.
Guest here.
Today we are going to have what I think is going to be a really interesting and exciting conversation about the future of AI. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into the field that you're in and kind of what you are doing today.
Okay, so maybe I'll start first with what I'm doing today. So I'm regional head of data at Endava. So it is a quite large international company helping our clients with digital transformation, basically everything from consulting to implementation. It was close to 12,000 employees now, mostly engineers. And while I'm involved with everything data, right? So from data engineering to machine learning, kind of my background and primary interest is in more towards the AI. So, I've joined Endava almost 3 years ago, and prior to that, I was working at a smaller consultancy, a more startup, let's call it, and for 9 years almost, yeah. I was actually trying to help companies start to use data science, machine learning. And since this was a while ago, it proved to be quite an interesting challenge. And I've learned a lot about, what the technology promises, but also then what is the actual reality when it comes to it being used or not. But initially, my background was quite different in some ways. I have a background in theoretical mathematics, although today I wouldn't consider myself a mathematician anymore, since this was so long ago. But some things that I've learned become useful as well from time to time.
Very, very fascinating. And something that you said that I certainly want to talk more about today is that chasm between the promise of AI and kind of where we stand today, what the reality is today. There was actually, and certainly we're recording this a little bit in advance of when this will air, but I did see just this morning that DALL-E is now available in a public beta. So they've published their API. And you and I talked a little bit about that when we first chatted about you coming on to the podcast. So for those that aren't familiar with what DALL-E is, can you give us some insight into that? I think a lot of people know, but probably not everyone.
Yeah, I'm sure. So DALL-E is a model that is capable of generating images from text. So basically, you can write a description of what you would like to see in an image, and then the neural net that is running in the background is able to conjure up an image that more or less closely matches that description. And I think it's good to also give a bit of a broader picture. So now I'm seeing in Silicon Valley especially, there's a term generative AI that is becoming very popular. And so, DALL-E is just one of the models that are part of this emerging subfield. But it didn't start with the images, right? It's just that at this point in time, maybe the images are what is most surprising to us, what is bringing both fear and joy to different types of people and companies as well. But the generative modeling in some way made the biggest breakthrough in language. So it happened a few years ago. Possibly the biggest event was the arrival of the model GPT-3 by OpenAI. Yeah, I mean, now it has become, I guess, a quite well known, or at least something that is commonly mentioned, but nevertheless. So to just give a brief recap how that one works, it's a model where basically it gets its input, let's call it context, or the term is also a prompt, and then the model is able to continue that text, that context that it received, so it's able to generate text. But the surprising thing is that this context can be extremely different. So it can contain questions, and if there are questions, the model will do its best to answer it. If there are tasks described in the text, in the initial text, it will try to solve them, and so on. Yeah, it's by now it is starting to be quite widely used, I think, for many different things. But yeah, that's especially good at things like summarizing text, translating it from one style to another, but also, some surprising things, like it can come up with poetry that's sometimes quite amusing. It can take up roles of different writers and writing their style and so on. But it can also help to develop ideas. And this is maybe something that's not talked about enough. So, for example, you might have an idea how to do something or a product, and then you might ask the model to provide a critique of what you are trying to do. And it's kind of good at that. It can come up with questions that you realize you would have to answer if you want to make that idea a reality. And also, after you get the critique, you could also ask it to help you answer that critique, right? So it can be a tool to help you think. Maybe that would be a good way of putting it. But this is language. It's images, but we have clearly not reached the limit for it, and the pathway, at least for some of the other modalities, is already it can be seen in which direction it will go. And of course, the next frontier is video. So we are already seeing examples of text to video models. So where you get currently maybe a few seconds or a few tens of seconds long videos based on the description. But exactly like we saw with images, this will scale. And I expect quite soon we will have, videos that are tens of minutes and and maybe hours long, simply being generated from the description in text what that video should contain.
Yeah, it seems to me that there is a fascination right now with some of the more artistic abilities of AI right now in the general public, right? We see lots of social media sharing of both images from DALL-E and other similar models that can create images from text. You can, I know OpenAPI has a model that can create music from a similar prompt. Certainly, you're talking about video. But what is AI really being used for in the business world? Because I think these capture a lot of the wider imagination, but that's not really where
Yeah.
AI is really being deployed today, is it?
Yeah. So to answer this question, we need to step a bit also in the past, right? Because however we look at it, the fact is that what is being used in most of businesses today is always a reflection of things that were developed some time ago, right? And the things that we hear are most talked about usually are the ones that will follow in the months or years to come. So there's a big difference between these generative models that we discussed and what machine learning used to be. So machine learning, or as part of maybe data science, was in most companies, it is used on structured data. So basically data that you would find in databases, data warehouses. And in most cases, it is used to create insights, right? It's not usually or often part of some automated autonomous process that continually learns and so on, right? So it's a lot of it gets to pattern matching, and most of it is done on data that the companies have as their own, right? So this is from where the term data is the new oil comes from. So companies realized, okay, this data is valuable, let's do something with it, let's gather more of it, right? So kind of like opening like new oil rigs or something. But then, the implementation of these models, and maybe I should just give a few examples, right? So where it is used, that would be helpful, I guess. So it's like cases like, for example, predicting whether a customer would leave, maybe predicting sentiment in their responses. It can be used to forecast sales. It can be maybe used to classify service tickets, or it can be used to prioritize calls in call centers and all kinds of applications like that, right? This is quite common. Yeah, so of course there are some companies using it in a different way, and through this it's everyone basically using it, right? Of course there's machine learning behind Google search and similar services, and all the translations that we are now seeing that are easier and easier to get and use and see. But to return back to this systems unstructured data. So the problem with these systems often is that first of all, it's really, really hard to get good quality data. It's always harder than people who set on this journey expect that it will be, right? And but it's also a question of use cases. So I find that some of these use cases are really used to optimize the existing business, right? So it might be, let's try and lower the costs a bit, or let's increase our revenue a bit. And of course, the business will see a profit. Maybe even if the revenue increases a tiny bit, the profit might increase a bit more. But rarely did this use cases lead into total transformation of the business model. There are of course some cases where it did, but I'm speaking more from a perspective of let's say more general business, right? And also there were a lot of people involved, right? And people that had to have a very specific expertise. And especially in the more early times, people doing data science were usually a lot of them came from academia. Maybe they had a PhD in physics, and since there was no, the ecosystem of tools was simply not there, or was quite hard to use, they had to build a lot of the stuff, bottom up, right? Whether algorithms or software and so on. So where is the difference now with these generative models? So surprisingly, a lot of the generative models don't really require huge amounts of internal data. So these models have been trained, or better to call it pre-trained, on an enormous amount of data that is to a certain extent available. It's public, right? When it comes to language, these models are trained on a lot of data that is scraped from the internet, or we might have archives of news and things like that. Or again, the same thing when it comes to images. And since these models have gotten so large and have been trained on such diverse data, they have gotten the ability to generalize to a certain extent across different problems. So when you have a specific problem at hand, you don't now need to totally retrain this model. You can simply use it to solve this specific task, right? So I mentioned a thing like the sentiment detection, right, in text. So how what you used to do was that you would take maybe some internal messages, and then you needed to annotate them to manually, right, to detect the sentiment, and you needed to have quite a lot of data, and then you needed to train the models on this specific data to varying results, right? Maybe your annotators were not very good, or maybe they didn't have good instruction how to do that, right? So there's a big diversity of opinion among them on the sentiment side and so on. But now with these models, kind of you get this type of functionality out of the box, right? You just write the instruction, what you would like the model to do, maybe provide a few examples, right? But not too many. And we're talking more like 1 to 3 examples rather than 100,000, right? And often, in many of these cases, it works very well out of the box. And this has a big influence now to who is able to use these models. So of course, machine learning engineers who work on the infrastructure that is capable of training these models and who are pushing the limits of the capabilities of these models are still deep experts in a certain area. However, after the models are trained, to simply use them, they are accessible to almost everyone.
Yeah, I think that is the thing that has really changed just in the last few years, is the accessibility and the ability for businesses to integrate these models for specific business purposes on their own, as opposed to having to build everything from scratch, because there are so many tools out there now that the infrastructure is there. You just need to build something on top of it to create a completely new product.
Yes, and maybe there is a good analogy to something that we are more used to thinking about, right? So, for example, when you onboard a new employee, right, to show them around how to do a certain task, in some ways, of course, you are seeking someone who has existing knowledge, right? They didn't start to learn everything from scratch like machine learning models used to do, right? You just take their existing knowledge and show them around, right? And it's kind of similar with this new generative models, right? You rarely need to train them from scratch.
Yeah. So we're seeing lots of really cool, interesting things happening in the world of AI. Businesses are and everyday people, whether they know it or not, are taking advantage of AI in a variety of ways. But I don't know about you. When I grew up, I watched war games. I watched The Terminator. I read Isaac Asimov. I I can only think of I think one movie that wasn't completely dystopian when I think of kind of what the science fiction idea of AI was. Um, how far away or how worried should we be that, HAL 9000 isn't going to start telling us what we can and can't do?
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of a diversity of opinion here when it comes to the dangers of AI systems. So I would say that there's a big division between the people who are concerned about the risks that the technology poses as it is today in its current form, right? So a common argument that you will find here, for example, is everything related to the bias that these systems introduce, right? Because of course, if you train a language model, for example, on the entire internet, it will obviously introduce a lot of bias into it, right?
Yeah.
And then it's quite a challenge to try to overcome this, and also in some cases there's a debate, right? To what extent, right? What are all the areas where you would need to debias and where you might actually not want that, right? For various reasons, but still, there's a lot of people worried about that. On the other hand, you have people who are worried about the risks that are yet to come, right? So what is around the corner where maybe today it's not a problem, but we can see a pathway to how it could become, right? So maybe a few like words about that. So the argument usually posed is such that so we are slowly seeing for all kinds of different tasks where we measure also the human performance on them. For many of these tasks, the models have reached, performance that is comparable to humans on these tasks. And we're also seeing in some cases these models overshoot human performance, like we saw with the well-known case of AlphaGo. And then the question always remains, right? So how further on can this go? And if at some point we have some sort of digital entities that are capable to surpass humans in most of the tasks, maybe not all of them, but most of them, what does that mean, right? Can we assure that these models will still function to our benefit? I mean, because it's fair to say that if you look at the present tense, I mean, the present, we are not, we are seeing many cases where these models maybe do not really serve the betterment of humanity as a whole, right? Without having to use a lot of imagination here or anything like that. So, and the interesting thing here is, I mentioned like a bit longer term and shorter term risks. The question is, how long is this long term? So we know that we had quite a few periods of AI winters. So basically periods where there was certain exuberance and high expectations of capabilities that then were followed by long periods of, disappointment or maybe even disinterest. I do have a feeling that now we're a bit on a different situation, and we have been for the last few years. So that there is too much pessimism when it comes to establishing or predicting where the capabilities of AI systems will be in a month, in a year, in 5 years. And so, when you're looking at some of the benchmarks that are used to measure the capability of such models, especially in the last few months, I saw quite a few examples. For example, models reaching performance today that was expected to only be reached in, I don't know, 2024 or something like that. And these predictions were not made by random people. They were actually made by people who have quite a lot of knowledge about the development of these systems. And on the other hand, of course, there are some cases, for example, with self-driving cars, that it's taking longer than it was expected, maybe at some point. And I feel that most of the attention of the general public is still on those cases, right? Because the cars, they're so familiar to us. And if we don't see self-driving cars on the road, the general impression quickly becomes, okay, AI is moving, rather slowly. But for all of these cases that are a bit less tangible, right? We are seeing really extremely rapid progress now. So personally, I am a bit worried, and I don't think that this long term is really so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of unpredictability always with the development of new technology. I think what concerns me more than a lot of technologies that are dangerous before is the availability of it, right? I mean, you're working in that field, but that's right. Anybody can, with a very small amount of knowledge, can get in and use these models and use them for whatever comes to mind, right? So when you think about something that's very simple like DALL-E, right, an image generator, now anyone can just say, hey, I want to see a picture that looks like this. And that image can be generated using AI, and that barrier to entry is very low. And I don't know that we've seen that necessarily in the past.
I mean, in some ways we have, right? Especially when it comes to really kind of general purpose technologies, right? I mean, a personal computer or internet was an example of such a thing, or mobile telephones. So something that at some point in time started to be used by everyone. Although by itself this is extremely powerful technologies. And currently when it comes to AI, it's a kind of I feel like it's a bit of a crossroads, right? So first of all, we were in this period where we needed like enormous computational resources to train these models, and we still need them, right? I mean, it's actually the requirements keep increasing, but also until now, our capacity to train them, or at least the capacity of huge companies to train them, has also increased. However, there are twists and turns here, and one such twist was the open sourcing of the model Stable Diffusion, which is basically let's call it a competitive model to DALL-E that was released and open sourced by the company Stability AI. And it is a model that can be run on consumer graphic cards, right? And I mean, not maybe the lower end ones, but still. And there's all sorts of ways how to use it, also over the internet. And so now the question is, right, what is the balance here between decentralized AI systems, which basically, companies close them off and then release an API just that you need to use to communicate with it or use it, and this decentralized open source systems that really anyone can run and use. So, and also when it comes to risks, of course, if everyone has something, if they have a bad intention, of course, they can maybe use these technologies to realize that intention. On the other hand, if you just have a few large, let's say, corporations who have access to this technology, and then maybe a single bad actor is somehow able to also get access to it, right? It's the worst balance, because hopefully the vast majority of the people have good intentions and good ideas of how to use this technology, right? So overall, if you have just a few individuals or a very small percentage of them who are trying to use the same technology for something bad, it's maybe similar to how we use technology in general today, right?
Yeah. Okay. So let's move away from the potential doomsday of AI and talk about something that you mentioned earlier. Intrigued me, and that was talking about how often we have bad data when we're talking about company data, whether that's data on customers or data on suppliers or whatever data that a company is using. But now we have models that need or rely less on data. What applications are you seeing today, or do you envision in the future from a business perspective where potentially I'll be able to not have as much reliance on my internal data, which may not be all that reliable, and still have really good outcomes?
Yeah, so let's start with the one application that's quite common, right? So recommendation engines, right? A lot of businesses use that, especially online. And the way most recommendation systems work is they try to, collect the breadcrumbs that each customer is leaving online, right? And use these breadcrumbs for guesswork. What could this customer be interested in, right? And I'm using this term breadcrumbs specifically because, overall, of course, these systems are useful and their business value has been proven time and time again. However, they are very often off the mark, right? And everyone has seen that, right? They're not able to, you still have this, you are searching for an item, you buy it, and then for the next week or so, you still get, similar items recommended. And, it still happens. And it's quite amazing, actually, right? And you need, to have an internal recommendation system that works well, you really need a lot of data. It's really hard to there's a cold start issue, while you are a small business, how to, even start using recommendation systems. But, this would all change, right? If you could simply ask the customer, right, what are they looking for? And if you have a way, how to match their reply, with your products, right? I saw a really nice example of that recently. There's this prototype application. It's basically a search engine for clothing, right? Where you can write any term. You might be interested in, you might feel in a certain mood, or you might be inspired by some movie. You just write this in, and then this semantic search is actually matching you with outfits that are a good match for whatever you enter there. So, in this way, it's a totally different experience. You don't need to really be so concerned with those breadcrumbs and, try to gather as much data as you can so you could be better at guessing. So this is one thing that I'm sure will change a lot. So how do we search? How do we find information? And also, I didn't especially mention before, right, when I was talking about GPT-3, but all these models can be used for dialogue, right? So you can actually, talk with them, and they are much more, much better at conversation than any chatbots have been in the past. Because again, how did the chatbots of old operate? Basically, again, it was breadcrumbs. So you said something, and then some models in the backend were trying to match what is the intent of this customer, and they had maybe like a list of 15 intents, and they simply try to match that reply to that intent, and then move the customer to the next step. And we saw that this really, in most cases, didn't work well. But these models now, they are quite different. I mean, you can talk with them about a variety of topics, and they are not so, they will, of course, you can ask them to detect a certain intent, but you could also build a conversation, an actual conversation with the customer, right? Which I don't think you were able to do online, except by somehow involving human operators, right?
Yeah. I actually was just recently talking with Jim Rowe about chatbots and what conversational AI has brought to that world. And it really is changing what the experience is with a chatbot, because to your point, not long ago, and I've mentioned this to him, like everybody hates chatbots, but that's because exactly what you said, right? That the chatbot was designed with such limitations and wasn't able to learn. And that really is what defines AI, is that it can learn, it can adapt, and it can change as it gathers more data. And those conversational AI tools are getting better and better. And you see this even in people's homes, not just the chatbots, right? But those assistants that we might use to do things in our home, those are using some of those same models to listen and respond and accomplish things that before, we had to get up and walk across the room to do, or had to hop online to do.
Yeah, and and there's another aspect, of course, that's related to search, and it's about the attention economy, as we call it, right? There are so many services now that really depend on your attention, of you spending time on that platform or service. And when it comes to search, this does introduce a certain strange incentive, right? The company is not so incentivized anymore for you to really extremely quickly find what you're looking for and go away, right? And for example, how the search currently works, right? You enter something that you're interested in, and then you get a list of results. But then it's upon you to check those results and interpret them, and maybe compare to see, basically a search engine just introduces you to a lot more work if you are trying to actually learn something or find out something. And now imagine how this changes if between you and certain information source, you have this entity, this digital entity, language model, whatever it is, right, that is able to process some of that information before serving it to you. So I think this is something that will quite fundamentally perhaps change these notions of attention economy. Especially since there is a good chance, like I mentioned before, that these entities will be decentralized. They will be perhaps some open source projects that will not be under control of any company, and that stand between you as a customer and the company trying to sell you something. So then it does, now it is often a battle between you and some backend AI system trying to sell you something. But then it might actually be a battle between those two AI systems, right? And that I think could be quite interesting.
So maybe the battles that we thought were going to be between AI and humans will just be between AI and AI fighting for the attention of us and our wallets.
Yeah, I mean, I was often thinking, and maybe here I will diverge a bit towards the scientific part, right? So one area where I feel we will see really interesting use cases, of course, in science, right? Because you know the I think that a large part of what we consider research today can be automated, right? So even though everyone would like to you know present their idea as totally original and totally different, I feel like the large part of the research is taking concepts from different areas, putting them together, and this in this way create something new. Um, and here, this agents or models, I think that they will be quite revolutionary.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I certainly it seems like AI has the potential to synthesize things much faster than we do. I mean, it certainly is proven that it can do a lot of things a lot faster than humans can to this point. So, I titled this episode something about whether or not AI was a bright future or doom and gloom, and we've talked about that. Is there something out there that you see or just really, really excites you that we haven't talked about that you think is maybe just around the corner?
Yeah, so maybe I mentioned two things, right? One that is positive and one that is worrying to keep the balance, right? So, okay, the first one is the ability of these AI systems to use tools. So what do I mean by that, right? So we are talking about language models, and for language models, they have some well-known deficiencies. Some of them are quite surprising, actually. They are usually not really good at arithmetic, for example.
Hmm.
Imagine this, like but people mostly aren't very good at it. If you ask someone to multiply two six-figure numbers, probably it will take them a while. And if they try to do it in their head only, you wouldn't get good results, right? And but how do we people solve that, right? You take the calculator or run an app on your phone or computer and do the calculation. And now it has been discovered that these language models often can do the same thing, right? So they can overcome some of their deficiencies by using tools or even
Hmm.
writing code that solves certain problems. And this is something that will open up a whole new area of opportunities and things that these models can do. So we will start possibly seeing a lot more cases where these models really become a kind of a interface. I've mentioned before, right, between when it comes to someone's trying to sell you something, but imagine now the other way around. Let's say that you want to do something with your computer, and now currently you still have to do most of the things manually. You keep entering things into various windows and move the mouse and so on, and a lot of it is very repetitive. And to be honest, it mostly takes patience rather than intelligence. And now imagine that you can use these models to to do these things automatically, really to understand your instruction, then for them to connect with various APIs, and then do these actions for you. So this is one area that I find particularly interesting at the moment. Now, like I promised, the worrying part, right? So when it comes to content generation, let's simply talk about the content, right? Because it can encompass all kinds of things. So currently, you had a limited to a certain extent amount of content, right? Let's say that you're talking about ads, right? You might have a few different ones, and then you use those breadcrumbs like before and try to simply push these ads to the groups that you felt, might be, they might have the biggest effect on them. Or for example, let's take movies, right? So studios invest a lot of money in creating a limited number of movies, tailor them a bit, to their target audience, and that's it, right? And while of course this content is compelling and it works, I mean, there's a limited match, right, between maybe the interests of the individual and how well this content is able to capture their attention. But now, if everything is generated, right, and it is so easy to produce this content, of course, then it really opens up the field of optimizing this content to achieve something specifically with a specific individual. And this is extremely risky, I find. So, I mean, even if we try to look at the positive side, oh, there will be all this amazing content, right? That's extremely interesting to you. But if this means that you will spend all your time now absorbing this content, this by itself is worrying. But if you imagine that there is an actor that has a certain motivation and wants you to, to achieve a certain effect on you to their benefit, and has now these tools at their disposal, this becomes quite worrying. And I'm not sure, how we will be able to solve this, but for sure, I kind of don't really see the case now that there won't be, of course, companies and individuals who would like to pursue this path, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like we're seeing a little bit of that today when you just think about how information is curated and presented. We see this in people's news feeds, what kind of information gets presented to them, and the information that gets their attention becomes then more popular as far as information that's being then presented to them, right? And so you end up getting things that reinforce kind of what you want to hear presented to you.
An echo chamber, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely concerning. And I think something that we all have to really pay attention to as we're the consumers of the content and thinking about how that's coming to us.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Boris, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I have learned a lot, and certainly you've made me excited and maybe a little bit worried about our future. But that was, I think, a large part of the intent. So thank you so much for joining Next in Queue and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, thank you, Rob, for inviting me. And I do hope that we as a humanity somehow manage to make the best out of everything that's in store for us when it comes to AI.
Next in Queue is brought to you by Happy2 and is produced by me, Rob Dwyer. If you enjoy this podcast, please by all means subscribe and or rate this podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. But more importantly, please tell just one person about this podcast. Word of mouth is the best way for people to discover new content. As always, thanks for listening.